What do you think a millionaire, who has everything in the world, could possibly be missing? When he secretly watched an ordinary employee, what he discovered wasn't weakness or mistakes, but the most expensive lesson of his life. A story about pride, the hunger for freedom, and a kind of love that money can't buy. Before we dive into the story, we've got a quick question for you. Has anyone ever walked into your life and left a mark you'll never forget? Share it with us in a comment. Who knows, your story might inspire someone else. Now, let's get into it. Leonard Hartwell, 36 years old, was a name every trading floor in New York knew. And not because he was friendly. On the contrary, Leonard was infamous for his ice-cold leadership style, his ruthless decision-making, and a stare that could make even veteran CEOs swallow hard. He believed in data, in numbers, and above all, in his ability to keep emotions out of every single decision. Leonard's success had nothing to do with luck. He came from a middle-class background and lost both his parents at 15. He clawed his way up from cheap rental apartments in Brooklyn to the sleek glass offices of Manhattan. He built Hartwell Capital into an unshakable investment empire, and kept it that way by never forgetting, kindness doesn't show up on a balance sheet. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, Leonard sat alone in his sprawling office on the 72nd floor. In front of him was the latest file, a small coffee shop in the Lower East Side called the Willow Bean, part of a portfolio owned by a restaurant group teetering on the edge of restructuring. At first, the Willow Bean was just another forgettable name among hundreds of assets up for liquidation or reevaluation. But something in the cafe's odd business report caught Leonard's eye. Revenue barely enough to stay afloat, yet an unusually steady stream of customers and management costs lower than industry standards. Leonard didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't trust any report either, so instead of sending in the audit team or scheduling a meeting with the manager, Leonard decided to see for himself. No warning, no name, no title. Just a few hours later, dressed in a plain gray t-shirt, dark jeans, and a worn jacket, Leonard left the skyscraper and stepped into the street like any ordinary man, blending into the crowd. The familiar Bentley was replaced with a nondescript rental SUV. No one noticed. A light rain misted over New York that afternoon. Leonard walked through the narrow streets until he reached the Willow Bean, a small cafe with fogged-up glass windows and an old wooden sign. Nothing about the exterior stood out. But inside, a warm golden light and scattered bursts of laughter from a few tables filled the air with something Leonard hadn't felt in a long time. Warmth. Simplicity. A kind of everyday comfort he had long forgotten. He pushed the door open. A soft bell chimed. No one recognized him. Good. Leonard picked a quiet table near the window, where he could watch everything without drawing attention. The server walked over. A young woman, around 25, wearing a green apron and her brown hair tied neatly at the back. She gave him a soft smile, not the polished kind Leonard was used to in high-end restaurants, but a real one. Hi there, what can I get you today? Leonard glanced quickly at the menu. An espresso, and I'll take an apple tart. Coming right up, she nodded, her voice light as a breeze. As she turned away, Leonard couldn't help but notice the ease in her stride, not rushed, not drained, unlike the servers he usually encountered. There was something about her. Something that didn't match the picture he had in mind of a struggling, forgettable cafe about to be absorbed into a corporate portfolio. He crossed his arms, leaned back in the chair, eyes narrowing. He was here to assess a cafe. That's it, just a straightforward business move. No room for curiosity, no space for irrational emotion. At least that's what he kept telling himself. A few minutes later, the waitress returned, carrying a simple wooden tray with a steaming espresso and a fresh apple tart. Leonard watched her movements. Clean, precise, no clumsiness, no unnecessary flair. Here you go, she said, placing the cup in front of him along with a neatly folded napkin. Homemade apple tart, so it's, not exactly five-star bakery material. Leonard smirked. An unexpectedly honest intro. He nodded but said nothing, just kept observing. She didn't press for small talk or hang around like servers are usually trained to do. Just gave a gentle smile and walked away. Across the cafe, a group of 3 men walked in. Slick suits, polished shoes, watches catching the light with a gold glint. Leonard didn't need to guess. He knew the type. mid-tier businessmen, used to being flattered. One of them, with slicked-back hair, let out a loud laugh and nudged the waitress as she passed by. "Hey there, sweetheart. Get us the best table in the house and bring out coffee for champions, yeah?" he called out, slapping the back of a chair like he owned the place. The girl stopped, her smile unchanged. So calm that Leonard leaned in slightly. She placed the menus on their table, her voice steady. "We only have regular tables and regular coffee. Winners or losers, everyone gets served the same." The whole cafe paused for a beat. The man froze, then burst out laughing, assuming she was joking. But Leonard knew better. He saw it in her eyes. This wasn't a joke. It was a principle. She turned and walked away, no bowing, no sweet talk. A little later, when she brought over their drinks, Leonard caught another detail. When one of the men tried to slip her a $50 tip, she just shook her head and smiled. "You keep it. A brighter day might be worth more than a piece of paper." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly thrown off. Leonard, meanwhile, smirked. A waitress turning down a fat tip right in front of so-called VIP customers? That didn't happen in New York. Not in cafes barely staying afloat. Leonard leaned back and took a sip of the rich espresso. He wasn't sure if the flavor was truly perfect, but that unfamiliar feeling, that quiet self-respect she carried so openly, was starting to settle in somewhere deep in his mind. She came back to his table, this time carrying a water carafe and gentling his glass. A simple gesture, but one anything else? She asked, her voice soft. Leonard looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time, deep brown, clear and steady. "No, thank you," he replied. She nodded. A small pause hung in the air, then she added with a quick flash of mischief in her eyes. "Oh, and if you're planning to tip just because the tart was that good? Sorry, I'll have to give it back." Leonard let out a quiet laugh, a sound he didn't expect to hear on a gray day like this. He tossed out a line, half joking, half curious. "You turn down customers' money? Careful, I might report you to your boss." She tilted her head, eyes glinting with something bold. "And then?" In a voice as light as ever, she said, "If someone thinks they can buy me, getting fired just saves me the trouble." Leonard froze for a second. Not because she was rude, she wasn't, but because of the raw, effortless confidence in her words. A kind of freedom that didn't need polishing or explanation. He watched her walk away, and for the first time a question echoed in his mind, one he never thought he'd ask himself. A girl like that. What's she doing in a place like this? Rain still fell softly over New York. Streetlights began to blur into the late evening glow, and somewhere in the rush of city life, Leonard Hartwell, the man who always believed the world ran on profit, found himself curious about a waitress who wouldn't sell her self-respect, not even for a $50 bill. The next day, Leonard returned to the Willow Bean. This time, he came more prepared. An old jacket, faded jeans, his hair tousled just enough to look unstyled. Gone was the polished image of a successful businessman. Leonard had become just another regular guy, exactly the way he wanted it. The cafe was busier that afternoon. Leonard picked a seat by the window. The waitress, Ellie, was still moving briskly between tables, leaning in now and then to listen, offering the occasional soft smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you give for a tip. It was something simpler, genuine joy. When Leonard ordered a cappuccino, Ellie brought it out within minutes. Same calm presence. She set the cup down in front of him without lingering, without fishing for compliments. "You came back," she said lightly, a playful spark in her eyes. "I did," Leonard replied, taking a sip. The coffee wasn't the most expensive blend, but there was something honest about it, just like her. He looked at her and asked slowly, "How long have you been working here?" Ellie rested the tray lightly against her hip. Long enough to remember the regulars, and to know who's just passing through." Leonard smirked. "Should I feel honored that you remember me?" She laughed. "Not so fast. I also remember the ones who always ask for extra sugar packets." He chuckled, surprised to find himself amused rather than annoyed by the teasing. After a moment, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his tone shifting. "I'm genuinely curious, in a city where everything has a price, why turn down a big tip?" Ellie sat down in the chair across from him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Because," she said, meeting his eyes, "some things lose their value the moment you put a price tag on them." Leonard tilted his head, arms crossed. That's a nice ideal, but ideals don't pay bills, Ellie shrugged. Exactly. That's why I work. I just don't sell myself. Her answer caught Leonard off guard. He'd heard hundreds of people justify everything they did in the name of making money. But Ellie, she didn't justify anything. She stated it like a fact. An older regular walked by and gave Ellie a pat on the shoulder. Hey kiddo, you singing tonight or what? Ellie smiled. If you stick around long enough, I might just butcher the lyrics for you. They both laughed and Leonard watched. The look in Ellie's eyes when she spoke to that man, it was different, softer, open. No defenses, no angles. When she turned back to Leonard, she asked, "And you, what do you do for a living?" He smirked, pausing for a beat. Investments. Ellie nodded slowly, as if what he said didn't impress her much. What kind of investments? Businesses, real estate, things that generate profit, Leonard replied. She tilted her head. So basically, you buy, you sell, and you make money off what other people need. That's one way to put it, Leonard said, his voice dropping without him realizing. Ellie rested her chin on her hand, studying him. Her deep brown eyes flickered with something unreadable. Have you ever thought, she asked, that one day you might need something money can't buy? Leonard's grip tightened slightly around his coffee cup. A simple question, but it hit straight at the part of him he always kept buried. He gave a dry smile, masking the unease. I don't make plans for failure. Ellie shook her head, her gaze soft, not judging, just a little sad. No one plans to lose their way, Leonard. But when money is the only thing you use to measure life, you can be completely lost and not even realize it. For the first time, Leonard felt the conversation slipping out of his control. Every word she spoke seemed to reflect something back at him. Not sharp, not loud, but piercing all the same. She stood up, adjusted her apron. Take your time. Around here, we don't charge people for needing a moment to think. And with that, she walked away, leaving Leonard alone, surrounded by the warm scent of coffee and baked apples. He rested his hand on his forehead, staring out the fogged window. The drizzle had started to fall. And in the middle of those cold, narrow streets, Leonard Hartwell, the man who once believed nothing could shake him, found himself unsettled by a few quiet words from a waitress. A strange girl who didn't chase money and didn't trade away her self-respect. Something was beginning to shift inside Leonard, slowly, quietly. He didn't know what it was yet. He only knew one thing. He wanted to come back. Not to evaluate an investment, but to figure out who Ellie really was. In the days that followed, Leonard all but made the willow bean part of his daily routine. He no longer pretended it was about monitoring business operations. He just sat there, sipping coffee, sometimes flipping through a newspaper, but mostly waiting for those brief conversations with Ellie. There was no pressure. They simply grew used to each other's presence. Ellie hadn't changed, still direct, gentle without being soft, thoughtful without a trace of pretense. She told small stories about the regulars, about a stray cat that liked to sunbathe by the door, about the old espresso machine that acted up whenever it felt like it. Nothing big. But Leonard found himself drawn in. One afternoon, with only a few customers around, Ellie sat down at his table, cupping a mug of hot cocoa in both hands. You seem to have a lot of free time, she teased. Leonard raised an eyebrow. You don't look too busy yourself. True, she smiled, blowing gently on her cocoa. Sometimes, stillness is part of the job. Leonard rested his chin on his hand, watching her. You're different from most people I've met. Ellie took a small sip. Different how? You don't chase what everyone else chases. You don't live the way people expect you to. She smiled, and something sparkled in her eyes. You know, Ellie said, her voice barely more than a breath, living to please others is a quiet kind of hell. People think they're free, but they're really just wearing chains they've stopped noticing. Leonard said nothing. Her words, simple as they were, echoed through him, cutting deeper than any keynote speech he'd ever sat through at a summit. And you? Ellie tilted her head. Who do you live for? Leonard let out a dry laugh. I live for numbers, for profit margins, for things you can measure. Ellie didn't laugh with him. She just looked at him, calm and steady. You can count all the money you've made, she said softly, but can you count how many days you've actually lived? Leonard leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting up to the ceiling. He didn't know how to answer. For the first time, the things he'd always taken pride in suddenly felt hollow. An old song began playing softly through the cafe, its melody warm and familiar. A regular whistled along, adding to the cozy hum of the place. Ellie rested her chin on her hand, eyes far away. "I used to think," she whispered, "if I could choose again, I'd be born somewhere people measured worth by stories, not by bank balances." Leonard turned to her. "Do you regret being born here?" Ellie shook her head and smiled. "No, I just regret taking so long to realize I had the right to choose differently." Something in her words caught in Leonard's chest. A quiet kind of sorrow, a beautiful kind of regret. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table, voice low. "Choosing differently, sometimes it means losing everything." Ellie looked at him, her smile touched with sadness. "No, sometimes choosing differently just means finally getting to be who you really are." Leonard sat in silence for a long time. He realized that his entire life, from the early days scraping by to the heights of financial power, he had never truly allowed himself to choose differently. Never dared to believe that success didn't have to be measured by a spreadsheet. A noisy group of college students burst through the door, snapping him out of his thoughts. Ellie stood up, adjusting her apron. "Anything else for you?" she asked, slipping back into her usual gentle smile. Leonard shook his head. "No, I think I'm full." Ellie raised an eyebrow, teasing. "Full? After just one cup of coffee? What, you swallow a few life lessons too?" Leonard laughed out loud, a real laugh this time, not the kind he used in meetings. He looked up at her, held her gaze for a long moment, then said slowly, "Yeah, I think I just filled up on your self-respect and freedom." Ellie burst into laughter, clear and bright like clinking glass. She walked away, leaving Leonard sitting there, feeling a little lighter, a little stranger, and somehow a little more real. For the first time in years, Leonard Hartwell wondered, had he traded too much for things that never truly belonged to him? Outside the window, the sunlight had faded, but inside Leonard, some quiet kind of light had just begun to stir. The next day, he came back, same time, like a habit forming without his permission. Ellie had grown used to seeing him. She didn't make small talk anymore. She simply placed a cup of coffee in front of him, along with a soft, familiar smile. The cafe was quieter than usual that day. A heavy rain had poured since morning, leaving the streets slick and glistening. Leonard chose a seat at the bar near the kitchen, where he could watch Ellie as she moved behind the counter, focused on her work. "Looks like you're getting addicted to my place," she said offhandedly, handing him a small cookie wrapped in wax paper. Leonard leaned his elbow on the bar, smiling. "Can you blame me? This place has an impossible kind of charm." Ellie laughed, soft, easy on the ears. She poured herself a cup of hot cocoa and leaned on the other side of the counter, facing him. "So," she said, half teasing, half curious, "how long do you plan on being addicted?" Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Depends. You planning to kick me out?" She tilted her head, eyes twinkling with mischief. "We only kick out people who break furniture. Silent corner dwellers? Totally safe." They both laughed, a kind of quiet, easy laughter that didn't need explanation. "Have you ever tried living a whole day doing absolutely nothing?" Ellie asked, her gaze playful, almost daring. Leonard shook his head. "No, I'm wired to work. Not working feels like slowly dying." Ellie widened her eyes in mock shock. "Wow, that's tragic. I'm the opposite. A perfectly lazy day? That's a day worth living." "Like what?" he asked. "Sleep until noon, drink coffee 3 times, read a book with no purpose, talk to strangers, and if I'm lucky," she smiled, "I'll meet someone patient enough to let me ramble all afternoon." Leonard rested his chin on his hand, watching her. This girl, with her simplicity and playful words, had somehow built her own little world, a world where everything moved slower, felt real, and stayed warm. "Looks like I'm the lucky one today," Leonard said quietly. "Been listening to you ramble since noon." Ellie laughed. "Keep pretending to complain. But let's be real. When you go home, the only one you'll be talking to is your laptop." Leonard smirked, offering no defense. She was right. His life had been packed with meetings, contracts, and emails, but almost entirely empty of real conversations. "You ever think," Ellie said, gently swirling her cup of cocoa, "that we confuse being busy with living well?" Leonard nodded slowly. "I think being busy is sometimes just a way to avoid facing ourselves." She looked at him, half teasing, half serious. Sounds like you've got the makings of a philosopher. Only if you agree to be my confidant, he said, part joking, but not entirely. She blushed slightly and turned away, pretending to focus on wiping a faint water ring from the counter. Leonard felt something soften inside him, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest like it belonged there. Outside, the rain kept tapping gently against the windows. Inside, the cafe felt like its own little world, one made just for the two of them. After a moment, Ellie asked, if you had one day to do anything you wanted, no obligations, no expectations, what would you do? Leonard thought for a long while. It seemed like a simple question, but it hit deeper than he expected. He realized he had never truly let himself imagine freedom. Maybe I'd just drive. No map, no destination, just go. Ellie smiled, her eyes lighting up with quiet approval. Then there's still hope, she said. You haven't been completely swallowed by the machine. Leonard rested his chin on his hand, eyes fixed on her. If I asked you to come with me, would you dare? Ellie tilted her head, pretending to think it over. Depends. Does your car have heated seats? Leonard burst out laughing, for the first time realizing how much joy a simple question could bring. My car has heated seats, he replied, and even classical music. Then what are we waiting for? Ellie winked. Just promise we won't end up lost in a desert. Leonard looked at her for a long moment, his smile softening into something rare, something warm. With you beside me, he said quietly, I wouldn't mind getting lost. Ellie froze for a beat, cheeks flushing pink, then quickly masked it with a playful pout. You should save those smooth lines for the soft-hearted girls out there. I'm not that easy to win over. Leonard just smiled, eyes quietly glowing. He wasn't in a rush. For the first time in his life, he wanted to slow down, so that every moment with her wouldn't slip by too fast. Outside, the rain had stopped. A faint rainbow arched across the distant sky. And in Leonard Hartwell's heart, for the very first time, a fragile little hope had begun to take root. If your heart just fell for Leonard a little after that last part, don't be shy. Type love in the comments. One late afternoon, with only a few customers lingering, Leonard sat at his usual table, slowly flipping through an old magazine left on the shelf. He wasn't really reading. His mind wandered, following the slender figure of Ellie as she tidied up behind the counter. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Leonard glanced at the screen, a message from his former assistant, Ethan. Found some info on the girl, sending it your way. Leonard frowned slightly. He had asked Ethan to run a background check on Ellie, just to protect his investment, he told himself, though deep down he already knew that wasn't the real reason anymore. He tapped to open the attached file. A few photos loaded. Ellie in an elegant evening gown, walking beside well-known figures from the finance and political world. Below the image, a caption read, Eleanor Whitmore, youngest daughter of the Whitmore family, a legacy real estate empire. Leonard froze. His heart pounded in his chest. Eleanor Whitmore, one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast, a name he'd heard whispered at auctions, private summits, elite meetings. But why was she, the heiress, wiping tables, making coffee, and turning down tips? He barely had time to collect himself before Ellie walked over to his table. You okay? She asked, setting a fresh coffee in front of him. You look like someone just stole your wallet. Leonard gave a strained smile, quickly slipping the phone back into his pocket. It's nothing. I just remembered something from the past. Ellie narrowed her eyes at him, like she could see straight through the lie. But she didn't press. A while later, Leonard stood and walked over to the counter, where Ellie was drying glasses. Ellie, he said, his voice lower than usual, can I ask you something? She looked up, her eyes clear as a still lake in the morning. Depends on the question. Leonard hesitated, then let it out, trying to keep steady. Whitmore. What does that name mean to you? Ellie froze. The glass in her hand trembled slightly, just for a second, but enough to let Leonard know he'd hit the mark. She set the glass down, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked him straight in the eyes. So, you found out, she said, not surprised in the slightest. Leonard nodded slowly. Well then, she exhaled, her voice dropping, I guess there's nothing left to hide. She leaned lightly against the counter, eyes drifting off into the distance. I was born into luxury. Fancy cars, giant houses, private schools, parties, all of it. But you know what? She looked up at him, her gaze sharper than he'd ever seen. Some prisons are built from diamonds and gold. I lived in one of those for over 20 years. Leonard's hand tightened into a fist. He didn't interrupt. My parents, they measured love in things you could count. A marriage contract, a seat on the board, a trust fund big enough to feed 10 generations. She let out a bitter laugh. I used to believe that was everything I needed. Until one day I woke up and realized I had no idea who I was without the Whitmore daughter label stuck to my forehead. Leonard stayed silent. All his life, he thought he understood how the world worked, thought money and status were what everyone chased. But now, standing before him was someone who had walked away from all of it just to reclaim herself. So you? Walked away? He asked quietly. Ellie nodded. Gave it all up. The name, the money, the power. I chose this small life, because at least it's mine. She smiled, but there was a trace of sadness in it, thin and quiet like smoke. Leonard swallowed hard. Then a question slipped out before he could stop it. And you've never regretted it? Ellie looked at him, her gaze calm, so calm it hurt. I'd rather die poor than live rich and never know who I really am. Leonard couldn't say a word. Her answer, sharp and clear, cut through every assumption he'd ever made about her and about the world he thought he understood. They both fell silent. No one in the cafe seemed to notice. Outside, the rain had started again, heavy drops tapping against the glass. Leonard gripped his coffee cup tightly, a storm rising in his chest. He didn't know if he was angry, in awe, or afraid. Maybe all three. But he did know one thing. From this moment on, nothing between him and Ellie would ever be simple again. He was no longer just a customer. She was no longer just the strange waitress. Between them now was a secret and an invisible thread pulling them into a new world. A world where courage mattered more than any asset. If you had to choose between a life of comfort and a life that's truly your own, what would you choose? Let us know in the comments. 2 days later, Leonard returned. This time, a weight pressed heavy on him, one he couldn't shake. He couldn't get Ellie out of his head, and he couldn't ignore the truth. She had once belonged to a world completely opposite of the one she lived in now. He stepped into the willow bean, his shoes tapping against the old tile floor with a steady clack-clack. Behind the counter, Ellie was drying glasses, same as always. When she saw Leonard, she offered a soft, familiar smile. Nothing seemed different. But Leonard couldn't act like nothing had changed. He took his usual seat. Without a word, Ellie brought over a cappuccino and set it in front of him. You look like you've been thinking too much, she teased. Leonard didn't smile. He looked at her intently, his eyes searching. I have a question, he said, his voice lower than usual. And I need a real answer. Ellie tilted her head. Go ahead, ask. Leonard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. If you were born with everything, he said slowly, why give it up? Why choose this life, serving coffee, wiping tables, living off spare change? Was it really worth it? Ellie's hands paused mid-movement. A brief silence hung in the air. Then she sat down across from him, resting her elbows on the table, her gaze so direct it felt almost piercing. Do you think I'm stupid? She asked, voice calm and even. I think, Leonard replied, you're throwing away a chance millions of people would spend their whole lives chasing. Ellie let out a laugh, but there was no joy in it. Then let me ask you something, she said, leaning in, eyes sharp as blades. If you had all the money in the world, Ellie said, her voice steady, but woke up every morning feeling hollow, do you think that's living? Or just surviving? Leonard clenched his fist. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Ellie held his gaze for a long moment, then spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. I'd rather wipe tables, wash glasses, and live off spare change than sit in a golden castle wondering if I'm still human. Leonard exhaled sharply, as if every layer of armor he wore had just been stripped away. You don't miss your family? He asked, his voice tight. You don't need them? Ellie smiled. The saddest smile Leonard had ever seen. I don't miss people who only saw my worth in the size of my inheritance. Then she lifted her head, eyes lit with an unshakable conviction. You can lose all your money and still be yourself. But if you sell your soul just to keep your wealth, then even at your richest, you're just a walking corpse. Leonard gripped his cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. Her words hit him like a punch to the chest. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. But Ellie didn't flinch. She sat there calm, like someone who'd spent her whole life defending her right to exist on her own terms. Leonard leaned over the table, face to face with her. "You think freedom is just running away? Living broke, exhausted, alone, that's freedom to you?" Ellie smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. "No, freedom is choosing how you want to be tired, choosing who you want to walk with, and knowing what you'll never trade, no matter how high the price." Leonard stood frozen, feeling like he'd just been knocked down. Not by anger, but by the weight of truth in every word she spoke. Outside the rain-slicked window, the last streaks of sunlight spilled unevenly across the wet pavement, and inside the small cafe, two people faced each other. Not with power or money, but with the quiet ache of hidden wounds from lives that once looked perfect on the outside. Leonard exhaled slowly, then sank back into his seat, like a man who had just lost a battle. Ellie stood, clearing the cups without judgment, without a hint of pity in her eyes. Just before turning away, she spoke, softly, almost like a reminder. "You could buy the whole world, Leonard, but you'll never buy a heart that truly loves you if you don't even know how to love yourself." Leonard looked up after her, his eyes, for the first time in his life, unsteady, uncertain, and quietly unraveling. He sat there for a long time, surrounded by the quiet clink of spoons, the wind slipping through the door, and Ellie's words echoing in his mind. Each sentence cut through the armor he'd worn for years, every word sharp and clean, peeling back the layers he thought made him strong. A week passed after that tense conversation, and Leonard didn't return to the Willow Bean. He needed time, not to be angry at her, but to face himself. He drove aimlessly through the city, past streets he used to see only through the eyes of an investor. Profit, opportunity, assets. Now, every alley, every dusty bookstore, every rundown diner felt different, like fragments of real lives, truly living, not just existing to make someone else richer. Leonard realized that for all these years, he had been chasing something he thought was power, when in truth, it was just a golden shackle, clamped tight around his own heart. And in the middle of that restless city, only one person made him want to stop, to sit still, to listen to the quiet rhythm of life. Ellie. On Saturday night, Leonard returned to the Willow Bean. The cafe was quieter than usual. Ellie was behind the counter, wiping down the wooden surface. When Leonard stepped in, she looked up. A flicker of surprise passed through her eyes. Then calmness returned, like it always did. He walked toward her. He didn't sit at his usual table. Instead, he stood at the counter, looking at her with a steady, quiet gaze. "I'm sorry," Leonard began, his voice low but steady. "Not for the questions I asked that day, but for taking so long to realize that real value doesn't lie in the things I used to believe in." Ellie looked up at him, silently listening. Leonard took a deep breath, as if gathering every ounce of courage he had. "I don't want to keep living a life where success is measured by things outside of myself. And I don't want to lose the one person, the only person, who taught me that, just because I was too blind to see it sooner." Ellie rested her hands gently on the counter, her eyes a mix of surprise and something quietly moved. Leonard smiled, not the smug, polished smile he once wore, but something softer, something real. "If there's still room in your small but free life," he said, voice warm, "I'd like to ask for a ticket." Ellie laughed, a bright, ringing laugh that lit up the whole cafe. "There's a ticket," she replied, eyes sparkling, "but you'll have to walk in on your own. No limos allowed." Leonard burst out laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that felt like letting go of an entire world he no longer wanted to carry. He held out his hand, no big gesture, no rush, just a quiet, honest offer. Ellie hesitated for a beat. Then she placed her hand in his. And in that moment, Leonard knew. This was what he'd been searching for all his life. A hand reaching for him. Not for his money, his name, or his power, but for the person he really was underneath it all. "We don't need the whole world," Leonard whispered. "Just someone who makes us want to slow down." Outside, a light spring rain fell. But inside that little cafe, two people had found where they belonged. Not in a skyscraper, but in each other's honest gaze. What about you? Have you ever met someone who made you want to be real? Made you want to leave all the flash behind, just to hold their hand? If you believe in a love like that, drop a "found you" in the comments. Thanks for sticking with us through the end of this story. See you next time for another kind of love.